Hello and welcome to the Well-Built Environment Forum webinar series. My name is Tarrant Parsons, and during today's webinar we'll be discussing the global construction sector, so both the recent performance across various regions as well as going over the outlook for 2025, taking into account macroeconomic conditions, the financial environment, and how firms are managing this backdrop. Just to give you a bit of an overview of the structure of today's webinar, the opening 5 minutes or so, I'll share some very headline level results from the latest RSS Global Construction Monitor, and this will then be followed by a deeper discussion with our panelists. So on that front, I am joined today by a great set of panelists who'll be sharing their expertise, and I'm very grateful to each of them for joining us. So if I could just introduce them to you, running down the order they appear on the slide. So first up, we have Christian Dan, who is an economist at DIW Econ. Christian, great to have you with us, and if you wouldn't mind, could you please give us a little bit of information about your background and what areas you're focused on in your current role?
Sure. So thanks for having me today. So I'm an economist with DIW Econ, which is the consultancy branch of DIW Berlin, the largest economics research institute in Germany. And I'm part of the joint research group that analyzes and forecasts the property market in Germany and the construction sector as well. And I'm happy to share my assessment today with you on the real estate market and the construction sector.
That's great, thank you. So next we have Laura Morgan, who is cost management lead at Focal. So hello, Laura. If I could just ask you to just tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Hi, thank you for the intro. Yes, so good to meet everybody. And I am Laura Morgan. I have recently joined Focal Middle East, and my role is looking after, or the lead for cost management. And I'm also looking after market intelligence as well across the Middle East.
That's great, thank you. So we're also joined by Holly Davis, who is a director working in major projects advisory at KPMG. Hi, Holly, over to you.
Hi everyone, thanks Tarrant. It's great to be here. So I'm Holly Davis, I'm a Major Projects Advisory Director at KPMG in the UK. So I'm a Chartered Quantity Surveyor by professional background, and I work cross-sector advising on delivery of mega projects, but smaller projects as well. I'm also the lead author for KPMG's quarterly Infrastructure Insights publications.
Thank you, Holly. And then finally, we have Rachel Parsons, who's Associate Director at Curry & Brown. Hello, Rachel. If you could please just say a few words on your background or experience for the sake of our audience.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I am Rachel Parsons. I work for Curry & Brown out of our Minneapolis, Minnesota office, and I lead our construction business intelligence team, and we are responsible for benchmarking, cost modeling, predictive cost analysis, and market intelligence.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. I should say we have over 400 registrations from 37 different countries for this webinar. I would encourage all of those in our audience to please submit questions to our panel. It does really help bring the conversation to life. If you're new to these webinars, you should see that you can submit questions at any time using the question box on your screen, and we'll pick up as many as we can as we go through the session. Now, as I mentioned before we get into the panel discussion, I just want to take a few minutes to share some headline results from the latest RSS Global Construction Monitor. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the monitor, it is a quarterly survey that we run at RSS. It captures feedback from around 2,500 professionals commenting on recent trends in market conditions, and we also gather forward-looking sentiment in terms of what is expected to unfold across the construction sector over the next 12 months. So the results are very useful in providing a steer on the outlook. So if I just go through some of the highlights from the Q3 results, so these were released just last week, and this should help set the scene or provide a little bit of context ahead of some of the more detailed views from our panelists. So to start with, here on the first graph is the Construction Sentiment Index. So this is a composite or summary indicator incorporating several of the variables that are tracked in the survey, and you can see it displayed here at the global level and then disaggregated by broad world region. Generally speaking, the global readings for this measure have been quite stable over the past year or so, although the latest return is marginally softer when compared with earlier in the year, but overall it is still consistent with a modestly positive outlook for headline activity moving forward. Now, when you drill down to the regional level, the picture does become a little bit more mixed. So on the weaker end of the scale, Asia Pacific was the only region to return a negative reading for the index. And you can see the results there have been gradually deteriorating since the early part of last year. Now, I would add that across different parts of the region, there's a lot of divergence. So India, for instance, that's seeing they're seeing very solid rise in construction growth or output across all sectors. But where a lot of the weakness is stemming from is China. So given the sheer scale of the market there, that has a significant bearing on the headline or regional results. Of course, the Chinese government has recently announced a significant package of stimulus measures to boost economic growth. So we'll see how that affects sentiment moving forward. But for now, China is seeing a weaker trend and pulling down on the Asia Pacific average. For Europe, I'd say the latest data is indicative of only moderate growth, but you can see that this does mark an improvement on the results that were posted throughout much of last year. I would say most nations that we track across Europe display quite a similar picture. It's still a bit of a struggle in some ways, but very gradually conditions are starting to improve. Germany perhaps does appear to be lagging slightly, but nothing too dramatic. The only European market I see as something of an outlier would actually be Spain, where the macroeconomic news flow has been much more positive of late, and that's in keeping with the stronger survey feedback we've received across the nation. And moving on to the Americas, well, this region has been consistently one of the stronger performers for a while, and still the latest results are very clearly positive, but it does seem that a bit of momentum has been lost in recent quarters. You can see that the headline index has eased back slightly. Now, within the region, both United States and Canada are still seeing an overall upturn in construction workloads, according to our respondents. But in both cases, I think the recent kind of impetus behind the market is perhaps not quite as strong as what it has been. And then lastly, the only region to see a pickup in its index reading between Q2 and Q3 was the Middle East and Africa. Very widespread growth being reported, and in particular is Saudi Arabia and the UAE. As has been the case for the past couple of years, these markets are still seeing exceptionally strong growth in construction activity compared to much of the rest of the world. And moving on to consider the factors that are commonly seen as hindering the construction industry, and these numbers relate to the global averages. The most widely referenced obstacle, so close to 2/3 of our sample highlighting it, financial constraints continue to hold back market activity. So hopefully the loosening in monetary policy that's now well underway in many parts of the world, hopefully that will be allowed to continue to unwind as long as inflation doesn't re-accelerate, and lower interest rates could perhaps ease some of the burden around financial constraints. But I think it's still set to be quite a prominent theme, I imagine so, over the next year. What is interesting is that the cost of materials, although still singled out by a majority of our respondents globally to be impeding the market, that the pressures around this do appear to have softened at least slightly. So back in the first quarter of 2022, we had 91% of respondents flagged material costs as a real issue for them, and this has gradually come down to 53% in Q3. And while it is, as I say, still a significant issue, if you look at projections for material costs, kind of inflation over the coming 12 months, these are now the least elevated that we've seen since 2020. And moving in the other direction, we actually have a rising share of survey participants that report that insufficient demand and high levels of competition are having a negative impact, and this may be linked with the kind of drop-off in momentum that we see in some parts of the world. And then still, of course, the perennial issue of shortages in skilled professionals across the industry, that's still being cited as a problem by around half of our global sample, and it's also reflected across all world regions to a greater or lesser degree. Now, moving on, this final chart depicts expectations for workloads or activity over the coming 12 months across the three categories listed here, so private residential, private non-residential, and infrastructure. And one message coming through very clearly is that respondents consider infrastructure to have the strongest outlook on this sector comparison across all parts of the world. That's generally been the case for a while now, and there's certainly nothing in the latest results to suggest this picture has changed. I should clarify, these figures that you see here are the net balance percentage of respondents expecting an increase in activity. Now, a very solid outlook for infrastructure can be seen, even if you drill below this, across most nations that we track. Now, when it comes to the other categories or sectors covered here, 12-month expectations are more mixed, depending on which part of the world you're looking at. The Middle East and Africa, I would say, continues to demonstrate the most well-rounded expectations. So all sectors are anticipated to deliver quite strong growth, even though infrastructure does lead the way. Now, across the Americas and Asia Pacific, away from infrastructure, will respondents envisage only modest growth within the private residential sector, and in both regions, expectations for housing development activity over the year ahead were scaled back compared to the previous results. For Europe, with infrastructure and private residential workloads that are expected to see reasonably solid growth, but the outlook is much flatter for private non-residential or private commercial. Now, Asia Pacific also displays, I would say, relatively subdued expectations for kind of both categories, aside from infrastructure. At least they're not negative, but they're not pointing to a particularly strong outlook, it must be said. So, as I say, a bit of a mixed bag, but still plenty of optimism with respect to infrastructure. And for the other market segments, it is more variable, and perhaps the future scale of any loosening in monetary policy will be quite influential if we are to see growth stimulated across the residential and commercial sectors. But that is my very quick summary of the latest results. If I just bring in our panelists now, and I'll start with Christian. So from the perspective of the areas that you cover, Christian, how do you feel construction's performed in 2024 so far?
Well, in 2024, it's definitely headwinds. So while there were still a surprise number of housing units completed in 2023, despite the sharp increase in material costs and interest rates, that was only due to the fact that there was a huge backlog of projects, simply because finishing times have increased drastically in recent years. We do not expect to carry that over to 2024. So while there were like approximately 290,000 housing units completed last year, we see a much smaller number completed this year. So that regards the residential sector. The infrastructure sector, I share your assessment that this has been largely unaffected and will be unaffected in the near future by the current macroeconomic environment. Looking forward to 2025, at the moment there is a lot of uncertainty in the market. For once, the current government coalition has just split up last week. There's going to be a re-election at the end of February. One of the biggest obstacles when it comes to construction in Germany these days is red tape and rules and regulations. And the current government was aware of that, and there have been projects in the making to reduce the regulatory burden for construction projects. What the new government is going to be doing in 2025 is everyone's guess. On the bright side, we do believe that while we don't see really interest rates going down, in parts because there is still an awful lot of financial risk in global markets, we actually believe that people will get adjusted to higher levels of interest rates, and that's probably going to change the long-term outlook. Other than that, there is really like a huge obstacle in terms of affordability, especially for first-time buyers in the market. On the other hand, there is a large need, especially in the housing market, for affordable living space. So this is the plus side. Although, like, we believe that in the medium term, and especially not 2025, this is going to change much. So we actually believe that 2025 is going to be like the low point for the construction sector. Although, like, having said that, you can even break it further down, as in like everything that has to do with structural works is going to suffer a lot in 2025, whereas anything that has to do with interior works will still be doing okay, in parts because of just maintenance and other areas that have to be tackled.
Yeah, thank you, Tristan. Yeah, still challenging factors to contend with across much of Europe. Holly, are you seeing something similar to that in the UK, or is it a bit more positive?
So if I speak about the UK, Tarrant, definitely some things that resonate from what you said in your introduction, and then also from Christian's observations, particularly around house building. So construction growth, generally post-pandemic is pretty limited, and house building activity continues to be the biggest drag on that. So in fact, in the UK, it was down 12% over 2023, and that's something that's continued into 2024. Our research shows that only repair and maintenance rates are showing consistent increases in growth post-pandemic. And in fact, when my team published the Q3 Infrastructure Insights, we were up about 3% year to date on construction output, really solely driven by increases in repair and maintenance rates of growth. And if I think about where the challenges are, again, a lot of similarities to what Christian outlined and what you'd outlined in your introduction. So inflation, there's definitely signs of that starting to level off, but the increases that has had are really baked into the industry. So steel, for example, is up 24% in terms of its material cost since 2019. Cement is up 34% since 2019. So real big above sort of that 2.2% target increases, spikes in materials. Skills challenge continues to be a big issue. So there's been, interestingly, a big swing in what the employment type is in construction. So big increases in professional services, again, since 2019. So architects, planners, surveyors up around 12%, but big decreases in manual trades. So declines in finishing trades and declines in number of construction operatives. So really seeing a shift to white collar workers in the industry. Something that hasn't come up so far in the discussion is around insolvencies. So at the best of times, construction is a very low margin game. So in the UK, around 2 to 3% main contractor margin. And in the UK, construction is responsible for around 1 in 6 insolvencies. And recent casualties that we've had, like ISG, which is very high profile, only emphasise that. And these are cross-sector impacts. So something I emphasise with clients is that commonality of challenges in supply chains that you see between nuclear, that you see between house building, these universal issues.
Thank you very much for that, Holly. So moving on to Laura, so you've seen our survey results are quite a bit stronger in the Middle East compared to elsewhere. Does that kind of align with your experience?
Yeah, I believe so. So at the moment, Saudi Arabia is one of our other key markets in the Middle East at the moment, and we have seen an overall decline in the UAE on the value of projects awarded in 2024, particularly in comparison to last year, which was a particularly strong year following the pandemic. So that the market leaders really at the moment are Saudi Arabia. We are seeing the other key markets like the UAE, Africa, Qatar as well. They have all got their own diversification and vision goals, if you like, that are trying to stimulate growth within the construction sector. And overall, the forecast statistics look positive for construction growth in the region. The UAE and Saudi are probably lower figures at around 3 to 4% compounded up to 2029. Qatar, I think it's got quite a bit higher than that. So yeah, the projects market is steady. It's not as strong as it was for the UAE. There's key sectors within that, construction being one, obviously the infrastructure sectors as well. And we are still facing some headwinds here. We have seen slight softening of material prices. The main concern in our market at the moment is the labour cost, which we have seen a significant increase, and that is a key driver for the increasing cost of construction at the moment. Certain commodities like your rebar and concrete, they are still elevated, but they're not as high as the peak in 2022. And we're still seeing fluctuations as well. So really the message that we're driving home at Focal is speaking to the market regularly, because we have seen since 2020 just month to month or even overnight changes with things like structural steel, rebar, concrete. And you know, we are susceptible to those changes, particularly with things like geopolitical tensions across the Middle East as well. And it's something significant that we are trying to monitor and just relay to our clients as much as we can, and have those open table discussions that really raise those issues and understand the program and you know, the timeline of projects, and you know, just advise as best as we can, really.
Thanks, Laura. And then to Rachel, we see the Americas as a region has been quite a strong performer, but perhaps losing some momentum more recently. What are your kind of views on conditions in your area?
Yeah, I think the industry has been strong here. Through the first 9 months of 2024, there's been almost 5% increase in construction spend compared to that period in 2023. So it is growing. But I think your chart captured kind of the economic uncertainty that we're facing here in the last quarter or two. I think a lot of people were waiting to see the results of the presidential election, and then who would control the House and the Senate here, and to understand what that means for construction. There were some campaign points that would have a big impact on the industry, such as tariffs, rolling back of some of the acts that have pumped investment into the industry, like the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Those have all been supporting the industry, and we don't know, I guess, if they will remain in place or if they will be rolled back. There still is a lot of uncertainty, I think, on which campaign points will actually come to fruition. So I think while we know the results of the election, we don't exactly know the impact of the industry, but people can start kind of planning again with the knowledge that we have. As far as like tailwinds over the last year, inflation in the US is the lowest that it's been in 3 years, and the construction material costs have normalized over the last couple of years, so it's easier for people to plan, while material costs haven't returned to pre-pandemic levels. They've kind of flattened in the last 24 months. And then we have had 2 interest rate cuts this year, which has made borrowing and financing a little bit more affordable. The economy, the stock market has been pretty strong over the last couple of years. And then outside of economic uncertainty, kind of an overarching headwind has been labor availability. We are struggling. There's a bunch of mega projects, and to get enough labor on your project is requiring significant incentives and per diems, which is driving up labor costs and kind of creating a lot of competition for scarce resources here.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, we'll certainly touch back on the election result in a little bit. I just wanted to come back to you, Christian. Do you have any insights on how companies are kind of managing the various economic pressures that we have in place? Are they, you know, what steps are they taking to keep projects viable and on track in this kind of environment?
Well, I mean, at the moment, as funny as that may sound, but the actual downturn in construction has somewhat alleviated the pressure in terms of finding qualified labor. There has been like a new framework labor agreement signed mid-year in 24. So cost increases in terms of wages will still be moderate, and we haven't seen like a huge increase in labor costs, for example, in previous years. So on that front, on the cost side, there like most of companies are doing fine. Plus, with the prices for materials kind of like not going down, but the cost increases are slowing down. So on the cost side, they're doing pretty okay, I would say. But a more general problem but that probably applies to companies in the US and elsewhere as well, is there's a huge labor productivity problem in the construction sector. So labor productivity has been almost flat for like the last 20 years or so. And a lot of companies are well aware of that, that something has to be done in that direction, although like so far not much is happening as far as we can see. When it comes to access to finance or project development, it's a bit hard to say. So far, we haven't seen, like, a large chunk of the construction sector consists of companies with 20 employees or less. So they're not really covered by official statistics because that's the cutoff point. But so far, we haven't seen many insolvencies in the construction sector so far. This still might be on the horizon for 2025, but so far it looks like as if most companies are surviving, and it's just going to against like profit margins rather than anything else.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Christian. Holly, any insights on kind of what companies are doing to manage some of the financial pressures that we have at present?
Yeah, absolutely. And in some respects, some things haven't changed. So from a contractor's perspective, there is no change in what I call those good hygiene factors of running a successful infrastructure project and keeping it on track financially, although obviously the margin for error in that space is now tighter. So that's principles like good contract setup, so getting a fair allocation between contractor and client for those big risks. And inflation's come up a couple of times in this call, and that is an area that I have seen change. We went about 10 years using the NEC form of contract, which is used very frequently in the UK for those major infrastructure projects, never using the inflation clause within that. But now everyone that I see is using X1, which is that provision that allows it to change for inflation, just because that's washed into the industry, that particular volatility. But again, there's good hygiene factors like running a cash positive position. So for contractors, making sure that they're getting the money in the door before it's going out, through factors like getting early payment for materials and for things that are long lead-ins, and then being tight on contract administration as well. So resourcing your contract management team well to make sure that somebody's on point for raising those compensation events and getting you paid for changes. None of those factors have changed with those headwinds and tailwinds. That will always be the case about what it means to run a construction project well. Where I do have more conversations now, particularly with construction contractors, is about wargaming for supply chain insolvency and then quantifying risk and contingency allowances. So around wargaming for that supply chain, because of that prevalence of insolvencies that we have in the UK industry, thinking of those additional factors when you're doing subcontractor selection, like being very intentional in comparing package values for that subcontractor with that subcontractor's turnover, with that subcontractor's order book for that year, to make sure that you're not over leveraging them. And then being really intentional about thinking who is on the critical path as you go through delivery, and what would happen if you lost somebody, how would you continue the project? And then with contingency and risk allowances, I have seen a shift away from contractors moving from where you might have had a benchmark percentage per package into a really scenario modelled 3-point estimate that allows you to express percentage confidence. So a real kind of like professionalisation of the way that contingency is quantified and managed. I think that has come into the industry as margins are tighter. And then if I think from a client's perspective, there really is increasing interest in alternative financing models. So we also just had an election in the UK, and there is increased interest from this government about private sector finances. So particularly with models like the RAB models, that's regulated asset base model, is a bit of a tone shift about making sure that you're getting projects viable using both public and private sector financing sources. And then, I mean, Christian touched on productivity, so I'll perhaps just say a final word on that. It's equally a problem here in the UK. Construction productivity, it hasn't increased since 1950s. and so that only exacerbates those issues that we have about skills within the industry. So we need to get used to doing more with less, and around those factors like industrialization, design for manufacture and assembly, being smart and intentional about the use of digital and AI tools. We need to make sure that we can solve that productivity problem and lean into that space.
Thanks, Holly. Yeah, the productivity numbers in general across the UK are very disappointing, construction in particular. So hopefully some of these new technical innovations will cause some progress there. But yeah, it's been pretty disappointing up in recent years, certainly since the financial crisis in the economy overall. If I could just bring in Rachel now, do you have anything to add from your perspective of your region in terms of how construction companies are managing various economic pressures?
I think what Holly said about being more intelligent and thoughtful with risk management is something we're seeing a lot here. Instead of it being kind of secretive and either all pushed onto the contractor or all held by the owner, we're seeing project teams work together to identify key risks, come up with solutions to manage it, and kind of share the implication of those risks. And we're seeing more of that. I think it's helping, instead of, especially after the price increases and the inflation of 2021 and 2022. We're seeing that a lot more here. So I think that's a key practice that should continue. Just being more thoughtful, more intelligent, using more data to identify risk and help manage it.
Thank you, Rachel. And then Laura, obviously, a different backdrop to elsewhere, perhaps, but are there kind of pressures that need to be mitigated?
Yeah, so just quickly, I mean, we have obviously seen, we definitely are in a similar scenario, if you like. What we are seeing more is a trend around value engineering. From speaking to clients, working with Focal now, that seems to be the main topic of conversation, and it's actually quite interesting because we see it done with just like the standard list with certain target reductions in percentages, but actually running thorough value engineering studies seem to be something that clients are interested in exploring. And with that as well, life cycle costing. But yeah, we have seen the pressures here as well. Although inflation's quite low, we have seen a significant reduction of competition in the market with contractors that have exited the Middle East or the UAE specifically, and are perhaps driven more towards the Saudi market as well. So it is, it is an issue in the UAE in terms of the competition that's also driving up, or the lack of, that's driving up prices. So yeah, it's definitely something that we're discussing at the moment, and to try and gauge, the expectations of clients and contractors. So again, there's been significant pushback with contractors on your standard clauses or on client bespoke contracts, perhaps, that are trying to dump the risk or to move the risk back to the contractor. And there's definitely been a pushback from that, especially since, I'd say, in the last sort of 3 years as well.
Thank you. Holly, you mentioned the rise in insolvencies across the sector in the UK. Because of this, do you sense that contractors are becoming a bit more risk averse? And if so, is that kind of impacting the construction pipeline?
So I would say so, yes. And if I could characterise the one thing that contractors are looking for in the current market, that is certainty. And we can look at things like during the recent UK election period, 13 tier 1 contractors in the UK collectively published what they called the blueprint for growth, about what they thought the industry needed to support growth. So that's folks like May, Salford BT, Costain, Skanska, setting out their manifesto for change of what they would like to see in the industry. And one of those factors has come up a number of times in this conversation about efficient risk allocation, and the recommendation, just like Rachel said, to really think carefully during procurement about who should own which risk. When I work client side, the advice that I give is that ultimately all risk makes its way back up to the client. So pushing that into the supply chain when it might not be the best place to manage that risk is not effective, and leaves you getting into a pickle when you come onto site to deliver your project. And the hot topic, of course, is inflation, as we've been discussing, and just being a bit more intelligent to think that those risks don't have to be binary. So, for example, I've got a project where inflation up to X% is the responsibility of the contractor, whereas if it goes beyond that point, that's a risk that's held by the client. So those risks are well articulated, and everybody's clear about who's holding what and how it's going to be managed. When I work client side again, I do talk to my clients about being a good client and what it means to engage early with the market in order to develop these risk allocation matrices and also an attractive incentivization model for the supply chain. And that returns to one of those themes of the blueprint for growth about setting the right budget early, setting the right timescales early, all as part of that risk allocation.
Thank you, Holly. Rachel, any views on this? Are kind of companies more risk averse given current conditions? Are insolvencies a similar problem in the United States?
I don't see insolvencies as a similar problem here. I think contractors are becoming more risk averse, but there's still room for them to succeed in the market in general here. One trend that is newer in the last 9 to 10 months is the investment, the private equity investment in contractors and engineering and construction firms in the US. That has doubled in the last year compared to the year before, according to a study that Deloitte did. Similar with mergers and acquisitions, just companies combining or purchasing below them in the supply chain to help strengthen them. So I think there are strategies that contractors, construction companies, engineering companies are taking to minimize their risk. But it's still there. Like I said, there's still room for. We're seeing more of them succeed. Not as many insolvencies here.
Well, thanks, Rachel. Interesting to see the difference there. And then, Laura, a bit of a different question for you, but what do you see as the biggest hurdles facing the industry in your area over the next 12 months, and how do you see the industry kind of responding to those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So again, thinking about around uncertainty as well and understanding, we track in the middle, well, we track so in the likes of the UAE and Saudi, we track against the US because we're pegged. So every time the Federal Reserve are reducing interest rates, we are in the same vein. So I do think there's been some anticipation around seeing where interest rates would be at the end of 2024. We've seen a significant demand. We're still quite a transient region, if you like. We have a number of people, from across Europe and the rest of the world that, are relocating here as well. So I think there's demand in certain areas, but understanding whether that's permanent. And I think the budgets as well from governments, understanding where the expenditure is going to lie, the investment in construction, following demand from consumers. The residential sector is always so significant, particularly within the UAE. And also just trying to grapple with the issues around competition in the market and these increase in salaries, which we know is catalyzed by the number of people that have actually moved jobs within the construction sector as well, which seems to be quite significant in this region at the moment. And we've also seen an influx that perhaps went to Saudi Arabia and they're now coming back to the UAE, and it's driving up those higher salaries. So this kind of seems to be the topic of conversations right now. But in terms of the Middle East value of projects awards, it's high for 2024, but there are some of the key markets which haven't seen as high of awards than previous years, which I think some people are quite surprised by. But I think it's there's other factors in that as well. I think there's also a pending legislation for decarbonisation, which I think we might come on to later on in this discussion anyway. But I think there's a number of developers that are perhaps keen to see what's going to happen in that area as well, and what that might mean for future developments.
Thanks, Laura. And Christian, your kind of views on what the biggest hurdles are for the next year in your market?
Well, I suppose, given what I've already said, I think the construction sector is doing pretty fine in terms of mitigating any risks from rise in labor costs, material costs, like that is not a risk factor anymore. However, in terms of like hurdles, the biggest issue when it comes to the German construction sector is really red tape and regulation. So currently there is a huge debate regarding, for example, the best practices and liabilities regarding new property development. So we have reached a point where it has become such a mess that if you look at certain regulations regarding environmental standards are looking fine if you look at them just without any context, but then they somehow like contradict stuff regarding fire safety. That actually gets accelerated by the fact that a lot of things, for example, fire safety is dealt with at the federal state level and not at the national level. So there are an awful lot of initiatives these days trying to kind of like reduce the regulatory and administrative burden of getting new projects off the ground. If that's gonna happen in 2025, we don't know. So if that still persists, then this is one of the biggest hurdles. Like there are a few initiatives. Architects and construction firms are lobbying for a new type of building that's supposed to kind of be less regulated in many instances, as this was the case in previous years. But the general problem is really that it has come to a point where if you don't follow kind of like what is supposed to be standard, then that kind of like constitutes malpractice, and then construction companies can be made liable for that. And this might even stretch to ridiculous things like soundproofing on balconies. Like I think we have lived without any soundproofing on balconies for the last 50 years, but all of a sudden this has become a thing, and that obviously drives up prices, but also kind of like the administrative burden. And this is kind of where we are at the moment, especially because the government is well aware of the fact that there is a need for more affordable housing in the country. Like the rental market is under an awful lot of pressure. At the same time, people can't really buy properties because real wages have been pretty much not growing for the last 10, 15 years. So there is an affordability problem as well. And now it's up to the government to step in and kind of like remove the wedge that they somehow have been driving into the market over the last decade or two.
Thank you, Christian. So we've obviously had a very high-profile election in the United States, Rachel. But I mean, during the campaigning, well, I know you mentioned some perhaps negative changes in policy that may be pushed through now. But was there anything mentioned that could be positive, or in terms of policies or incentives that could boost the market, or do you think a change in approach might actually be to the detriment?
There's certainly more that we'll be watching that we view as risks, but one thing, it actually follows quite nicely with what Christian was just saying, is that President-elect Trump campaigned on deregulating many industries, streamlining our permitting process. While that's maybe not a win for environmentalists or climate activists because they use the permitting process to, ensure that projects won't be detrimental to the environment or the climate, it will probably speed up time to start building your project. So I think deregulation and trying to get our permitting process a little bit more efficient will definitely be benefits to the industry as far as like output and getting projects moving a little bit quicker.
Thank you, Rachel. And Holly, we've recently had the first budget event from the new Labour government. Any views on the kind of impact of measures that have been announced there, or are there policies that you'd like to see introduced that you feel would have a positive impact on the sector?
So there's some biggies in there that I'm quite interested to see how they shake out and how they have an impact on the industry. So again, when I mentioned earlier the view from the tier one contractors, it was that visibility of a long and stable pipeline, that certainty that they were looking for. And one of the things that was announced as part of the recent budget is publishing a 10-year infrastructure strategy, which is coming in the spring alongside phase 2 of the spending review, which is going to give that longer time horizon approach, which we think will give a lot of confidence to the industry in terms of the pipeline that's coming. Similarly, there's a commitment to move to 5-year capital budgets and then extending them every 2 years. So you avoid that cliff edge that previously used to come with funding allocation on a 5-year or spending review cycle, and then uncertainty about the next one. So all of this building in a long-term view on commitment to expenditure on infrastructure projects in the long term. And then speaking to Christian's point about red tape, that pre-construction period can be really long, particularly in the public sector. That period between initial strategy and then getting a spade in the ground, that can be multiple years. So the government has committed to, and many of our attendees may have read about this, the National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority, so NISTA in the UK, is a new body to drive more effective delivery of infrastructure across the country, and they're going to have a role in assurance mechanisms and an enhanced role in validating business cases prior to Treasury funding approval. So I'm personally excited to see what changes NISTA can have in making that pre-construction period smoother and reducing some of that red tape that Christian spoke about.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of positive messaging from the Labour government in terms of simplifying the planning process and obviously increased budget or public spending on investment, and so yeah, a lot of positivity, I guess. But the simplification of the planning system has probably been a message coming from a lot of administrations recently, and whether it's had tangible benefits is a bit unclear. People still say it's kind of too long and too complicated, too expensive as well. So Christian, any kind of views on policy initiatives that could kind of boost the sector?
Well, there have been a few initiatives in 2024 trying to boost the construction sector in Germany. The biggest one is probably like how real estate projects and property values can be written off. So depreciation rates and the whole procedure around them have changed in Germany. That obviously changes the net present value of any construction project. However, so far we haven't seen any effects in terms of that construction investment has picked up again because of that. There have also been a number of government programs with low interest rates, mortgage loans, either to consumer or to construction companies. But that still hasn't really changed the entire market environment. It probably has contributed a little bit to construction work getting done or getting off the ground. But in general, like the bigger problem is still that the market is just like not in a great shape as it is, despite the fact that there is actually a huge, well, hidden demand for housing as well as infrastructure projects. I mean, for example, a few weeks back near Dresden, a bridge simply collapsed during midday, and that hasn't happened like in I don't know how many years. Not that this is kind of like emblematic for the current state of the German infrastructure and roads, but there's definitely a lot of maintenance, for example, to be done in the realm of infrastructure.
Thank you. So going back to you, Holly, obviously sustainability is going to be a huge area of focus for construction in the years ahead. So from your perspective, you know, how are climate change, resilience, and decarbonisation being factored into both existing and future projects?
Yeah, such an important and timely question. And I think I see that in two main categories of impact. the first of those is around the types of project being progressed, and then the second is around individual project impact. So when I think about the type of project being progressed, particularly in the UK, we're seeing a really big focus on decarbonising the grid. So in October in the UK, we had our last day using power from a coal-fired power station, and wind power in the UK is actually our greatest source of energy generation, which I found surprising as a statistic. But the Labour government is investing quite heavily in taking forward projects which decarbonise the grid. So large-scale new nuclear, so Sizewell C plus another one, small modular reactors via GBN, so Great British Nuclear, carbon capture and storage, the geological disposal facility, onshore and offshore wind. So I think only we'll see more commitment to spending in these low carbon ways to generate power. Then on an individual project level, I am seeing an increasing trend of projects becoming self-sufficient. So if we look at Meta, Google, Amazon, they're all exploring the use of small modular reactors for their data centres. Many have made those announcements about partnerships that they're exploring, rather than relying on the grid. So those data centres have got a very high use of power, but I think we'll see all the more of this self-generation in comparison with efficient design. And then finally, just thinking about climate change resilience. So things like the Environment Agency's Thames Estuary 2100, so what we call TE 2100, that's that really long-term plan for flood defence, considering that flood levels are likely to be higher than historic projections would have forecasted. So that long-term view about resilience of individual projects to the effects of a changing climate is something that I'm just seeing increasingly. And then I was allowed a plug, wasn't I? So we have been working with Major Projects Association on a sustainability playbook that gives that shape to the four lenses of sustainability: resilience, biodiversity, net zero carbon, and social value. So every project can think about what lenses should we bring in at which point in our projects to make sure that we are doing what we should be doing to fully consider sustainability in both design and construction.
Thank you, Holly. And Laura, are you seeing a shift in attitudes towards sustainability in your area?
So we're definitely encouraging those conversations, and we, as part of Focal, we have our sustainability team and engineers as well, and it's definitely trying to encourage that open line of communication with our clients and really understanding what their targets are. Obviously, we've made commitments countrywide, and clients have their own agendas as well. So it's really trying to understand how they are implementing decarbonisation, but also net zero targets as well. But we are still progressing in that area in the Middle East. We're still waiting for key legislation to come into place to really understand what that means for built assets and for future planned assets as well. But we are definitely having, as I mentioned earlier, a greater conversation around value engineering targets, specifically aimed at engineering options, particularly around life cycle as well. So we are having those conversations with clients, and I think they can appreciate the value add of what that can bring to their projects, particularly when we are seeing elevated construction prices from the contracting sector as well. So I think if there's opportunities there around value engineering and really, creating that value-centric line of communication, which also will obviously involve sustainability and decarbonisation opportunities as well.
Thank you. And Rachel, how's the kind of push towards more greater adoption of more sustainable practices? How's that developing in the United States?
The last couple of years have been quite promising in that regard, with the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure and Jobs Act dedicating significant investment to clean and renewable power. So we're seeing a lot of construction around that. We'll see what the next 4 years look like. Like I said, if that legislation survives, based on campaign points, we're likely going to see federal tax incentives or federal incentives shift from clean and renewable energy back towards fossil fuels. But at the same time, we saw multiple states pass additional climate measures in this last election. So at a federal level, the incentives might be shifting kind of away from that clean renewable energy. But on the state level, we are seeing more and more states commit to net zero, which requires obviously clean renewable energy. And then a lot of companies realize that like natural disasters, weather events are getting worse here. They're impacting people's lives, they're impacting profits. So a lot of companies are putting in the time and the money to understand how to lower their embodied carbon, understand how to electrify their buildings, kind of moving that way, despite us not having the strong federal regulations that require it.
Thank you. And Christian, do you have anything to kind of add from your perspective there?
Well, actually, let me answer this question twofold. So on the one hand side, like when it comes to reducing the construction sector's carbon footprint, well, at the moment, they're reducing it by constructing less. However, like looking more at building materials and the life cycle of a property is like, it's really hard to judge for us because a lot of the building materials are imported into Germany from, for example, Eastern Europe. They have a completely different energy mix than Germany has, for example. They're much more tilted towards coal, which obviously means like the carbon footprint could be much better when using, for example, domestically produced materials. Or the life cycle of building. This is one area where the regulations are pretty strict, but in a good sense. On the other hand, I mean, the requirements in terms of insulation and energy consumption during usage are pretty strict. On the other hand, and this is kind of like the flip side of the coin, is like these rather strict regulations also prevent the use of innovative materials, for example. So I've heard, for example, that in Ireland, maybe I'm wrong about this, it's just something that came up the other day, they're using, for example, pretty innovative materials for insulation, so everything that is not structural, that couldn't be used here simply because it's kind of like not within the realm of what is covered by current regulation. When it comes to the immediate effects of climate change, such as natural disasters, there's a lot of talk about changing the zoning laws for property development, but that also kind of like puts even more pressure on the construction sector, because even these days, space for developing new projects is pretty scarce and limited, particularly in urban areas, with the exception of Berlin maybe, but just moving kind of like properties away from risky areas just to avoid them getting caught up in the next flooding or any other natural disaster, kind of like makes it even more difficult to kind of like build projects and find spaces to build projects.
Thank you, Christian.
And, and then just in case the audience might be interested in that sort of thing, there's a DIW weekly report coming out tomorrow at around lunchtime, specifically dealing with the energy efficiencies of the construction sector in Germany.
Thank you. We have had a question come in from our audience for Holly. I don't suppose it's the easiest one to answer, but how can we as contractors manage the new national insurance change that will come into force on the 1st of April 2025?
I mean, that's an excellent question, and I'd say it's one of those areas that needs specific HR advice, because it has one of those potential implications in the same way that IR35 changes did have in terms of impacting your labour resources. So I think the best general answer that I can give is to work with those HR professionals to make a specific plan that includes an impact analysis of how that is going to affect your particular supply chain, which looks different for every one of the contractors depending on how much you self-deliver versus how much you subcontract. So I'd say make a specific plan.
Thank you, Holly. We really only have a minute left now, but I did want to end on a more upbeat tone. So we could all just have a very, very brief answer in terms of which segments of construction have the most promising outlook. So, Holly, are there any sectors that come to mind as displaying an especially promising outlook?
If I could have a quick initial vote for data centres, it's one of those areas, every conversation that I seem to be in at the moment has something about how could we use AI to impact the work that we're doing. All of that needs data centre space, so we're just seeing more and more of those constructed worldwide, so definitely that one.
Thank you. It's the same to you, Rachel.
I will echo data centers and add semiconductors, and then we also will need infrastructure to power our data centers.
Great. And Christian?
Well, I just follow the lead. So there's definitely a case for non-residential property investment. But on the other hand, I mean, when it comes to Germany, there is a huge demand for housing as well as infrastructure projects. It's just that the financial side of things are not looking that bright. Once that kind of like is out of the way, I think future looks splendid.
Thanks. And finally, Laura.
I think it's quite a wide-ranging answer, but I would say data centers, based on conversations with clients and where we're seeing growth generally globally, but also in the Middle East as well. Enhancing communities, we've seen the boom in the residential sector, but also we're lacking a bit of social infrastructure in those developments in the communities, is particularly where perhaps there's outside of the main city areas that are being developed. And just key sectors which seem to be remain high here, which is residential, mixed use, along with infrastructure as well across those.
Thank you very much. We're sadly out of time now. It has been a really great discussion, so a massive thank you to all of our panelists for their contributions. It's really insightful from everyone. A reminder that we will publish actually a recording and a written summary of this webinar online, so please feel free to share those with your professional networks. Also, we would be grateful if you could take just a few moments to let us know what you thought of today's session by completing the online poll, which will appear on your screens at the end of the webinar. We've got several more webinars scheduled coming up over the next couple of months. So listed here are the topics that will be covered in those sessions. And if any of these are of interest, please do sign up.